Welcome to the Hands-On Business Podcast, the place you come to get tips, tricks, and advice on growing your business. This is a podcast where you can hear real business leaders discussing systems and methodologies that they have used to help them catapult growth in their business. So I'm your podcast host, Hakeem, and I've grown several small businesses to multi-million-pound enterprises. And whilst doing that, I noticed that there wasn't really any place that focused on where I was, i.e. growing a small business. All the content that was out there seemed to be about big businesses and often just a lot of theory and not practical, implementable advice. And hence, the Hands-On Business Podcast is born to fulfill that gap. Today will be one of my shorter business bite sessions, which you probably know by now is effectively me musing about a topic which has piqued my interest. Now, I've got no idea why, but recently I've been getting a lot of people asking me, Hakeem, what's the most important thing I can do to increase the speed of my sales cycle? So since I am actually the author of the Sales Acceleration Formula, I thought I'll do a podcast on the first part of the ADAPT process, which is the basis of that formula. Now, obviously, the first step in the ADAPT process is the A, and that stands for accounts. And when I'm talking about accounts, I'm effectively talking about customers. I call them accounts, but they're customers. Now, the whole point of the Sales Acceleration Formula is that it's a tried and tested methodology that I've used and worked on for the last 2 decades, which helps people to, number one, raise the level of your sales achievement, number two, raise the consistency of your sales achievement, and number three, raise the speed of your sales achievement. So, as I said, it's a 5-step process called ADAPT. And I think that the most important step of any process is the first step, because if you miss that out, then generally everything else stands on shaky ground. And what I want to talk about today is that A, accounts and account selection, basically customers. So this starting point, the A, is all about giving yourself a chance, because the first thing that you need to decide when you're in any market is which customers are you going to work with and why. How are you going to choose the accounts that you're going to work with, which give you the best and most rapid chance for success. Now, just to be clear, I'm not talking about just identifying your target market. I'm assuming that you've already done that segmentation and you now have a number of accounts in your target market that are your pool of potential customers. Now, the key here is to understand that not all customers are created equally, and therefore you need to segment your customers into the ones that have the most potential from a financial point of view, but also the ones that are most probable to want to do business with you. Now, if you miss out either of these factors, you're going to have a serious challenge on your hands. Now, let's elaborate on the factors which can contribute to potential and probability so that you know what I'm actually talking about. I'll start with potential, as this is probably the thing that most companies take into consideration when they're looking at prospective customers, i.e. what is the opportunity that those customers present, which is normally in most companies defined as potential. And some of the parameters which can be taken into account when you're discussing potential are, and certainly not exhaustive, but size is one of the things that people look at. So all other things being equal, then it just makes sense to look at the largest accounts in terms of the number of people, customers, systems that are out there, because theoretically that will give you the biggest financial potential. Doesn't always happen to be the case, but that's one of the things you look at. You can also look at historical sales. You can look at your own sales as well as your competitors, as this gives an indication as to the demand for your kind of product and or service in those customer groups in those accounts. Then another one you can look at is sales growth. This is generally the same as historical sales, with the added benefit of helping you understand the current and potential future opportunities rather than just what's happened in the past. Market share is yet another one that people look at, again, for both you and your competitor, and that'll give you valuable insights into opportunities to grow, as well as understanding how interested the account is or is not in the type of product or service that you're offering. And as I said, we could go on. There's lots of other parameters that you can look at, but these are a few that I find of the common ones. And as I said, by no means is this list exhaustive, and each company will obviously have its own specific measures, but it's a good starting point, and you need to clearly define in your business what potential looks like. Now, That's just a bit on potential. But if you only look at potential, which lots of businesses do when they are looking at which customers to target, then without looking at the second parameter, i.e. probability, which is the one I want to go on to discuss, you may find that you're not actually providing what the customer wants and or needs, or you can't access them for one reason or another. Often, this is what companies focus on. They only focus on potential when they're starting to segment accounts and where they're going to go. And they choose the biggest ones and they throw a lot of resource at them without looking at the probability that the account or that customer will actually work with you. Now, this automatically leads to frustration and a slower sales process, which is why I always introduce the second parameter, i.e. probability. Now, for some reason, fewer companies take this into consideration when trying to identify which customers they should target. So what I want to do is go through some examples of probability which can help you accelerate your progress. So again, it's going to be an exhaustive list, but it's going to be a good start, I think. So number one, I always start with relationships. Relationships can obviously come from many different sources. You know, people who are working with you currently, people who worked with you in the past, you know, what are your personal, professional connections, etc. that you have? Because if you or your company have a good relationship with somebody, they're likely to trust you, then that customer is obviously more likely and you've got more chance that they're going to want to do business with you now and in the future. Another extension of that is current satisfied customers. We all know the old sales adage that it's easier to sell to an existing customer than it is to sell to a new one. Therefore, if you have a satisfied customer and everything else is equal, then you want to be identifying how to increase the lifetime value of your current customers as a priority. So that's another one. One which lots of people don't often think about, I've noticed, is your access. Obviously, if you can't get in to see those customers or you can't get access to those customers or that access to that customer is difficult, then actually very little else matters. It doesn't matter how big it is. If you can't actually get access to there, you're not going to be given the chance to discuss your solution, your product or your service. And it could be the best thing ever that you have, but your customer will never really know about it because they're inaccessible to you. So access is a very interesting one. And that's why I talk about relationships, etc. Because if you've got relationships, that's going to increase your access, obviously. Then another one is strategic fit, you know, and that's about in your customer's eyes, what is your unique business value? Have they seen the evidence? Does your product service fit with the customer's current or their own future vision? This is another very important thing that you need to think about. It's not just about you. It's about what's that strategic fit. So then the last one I'll mention here is financial stability. Now, it obviously requires research, but you want to ensure that a customer that you plan to do business with has the money to pay now and long into the future. Because if they struggle to pay suppliers or they're on the verge of bankruptcy, then it doesn't really matter how big they may be. It's going to cause you problems. Just think here about companies like Enron that no longer exist, which were massive. And for my UK listeners, companies like Debenhams. Just imagine that you were a supplier to those businesses. You've done your market research. You said, right, these guys are massive. I've got some relationships in there. So these are some of my key accounts that I need to target. But because you haven't looked at the financial stability, you've then, I've written my golden ticket, I've got business with Enron, I've got business with Debenhams, and then you've supplied them your services, your products, and then they go out of business. So you're then now out of pocket. And there's lots of companies that did that, but then went bankrupt on the basis of those other companies going out of business. So it's really important. It's a real critical point to make sure that you look at the financial stability when you're looking at those accounts. Now, that's probability. And as I said, this is not an exhaustive list. So there's lots of other things that you can take into account. And I want to give just a cautionary note here. The problem with only focusing on accounts which have a high probability of working with you, whilst it's good to make sure that you engage in that, is that whilst you may engage and enter into a commercial relationship with them relatively quickly, because you've got a good probability with them, just before you start doing your happy sales dance, you look at the value of that sale, and the value is then so small, you start to, was it all worth it? So that's why I always say that you need to look at both of them, because the sweet spot, therefore, for your account segmentation, for your customer segmentation, is obviously when you have favorable potential, i.e. you have a high potential, and it's coupled with favorable probability. And we need to constantly ask ourselves, Number one, how much do we actually know about our accounts and customers? Number two, where is the biggest potential within my given geography and my given sales segment? And then number three, how probable is it that they will want to do business with me? And fourth and finally, how can I gather this information to make an informed choice on where to invest my valuable time? Because that's the sweet spot, and that's how you start to really accelerate your sales process from the start, because you're only going to places where you've got a high probability that they're going to work with you and there's a high potential. Now, I'll suggest that on the basis of this podcast, this short little podcast, you do a little exercise and you take a piece of paper and write down 4 parameters of potential that you're going to measure, and then 4 parameters of probability for your specific business. Then you can then find that sweet spot, and then you can start ranking your accounts based on that. And that's where you should start. Now, if you need any help at all, then just contact me on LinkedIn. And if you want to pick up the show notes, head over to the salesaccelerationformula.com/podcast-show-notes, and you'll be able to subscribe to our mailing list and get show notes for every single episode. And as always, subscribe, like, and share with your friends, colleagues, and anyone else who you think may be interested. But most of all, keep the feedback coming so that we can continue to improve and give you more of what you like. Hope you enjoyed this as much as I did, and as I always do. Keep listening and keep growing.